All right, so I just caught this guy in my house. I have no idea who he is. He doesn't appear to be here to steal. He could be an undercover cop, but I don't know. I don't think the undercover cops use their cell phones as cameras. They have more expensive cameras. So he's about to ask me some questions. I'm going to play along with him here. I'm not really sure what's going to happen, but what the hell? I still have a sense of humor.
The 45 minutes we just did actually was on mute. Can we start over?
I hope that's not true. I imagine that you're kidding.
All right.
That,
Okay, so by your definition, you're the most prolific, use your own words here, prolific movie maker of all time?
of all 127 years of movie making history, assuming that movie making started in 1895.
And how many movies is that?
701.
And of those, how many are what you would consider features, and what does that mean to be considered a feature?
213 features. A feature for me is an hour or longer.
And I know we already discussed this, but you contacted the Guinness Book of World Records, and they responded the first time saying roughly what, and then the second time, what else?
Well, the first time I contacted them, I was trying to get recognized for the record of the person who had made the most feature-length movies, and I had made maybe 108 at the time. And they said that they couldn't give me the record because they had a previously existing record holder who had made 110. But they said that I should feel free to contact them again if I surpassed that record. So I did surpass that record, and I'm now up to 213, but I think I contacted them when I had made 111. And I was told that they do not accept proactive submissions to this category.
So, like, meaning, like, don't solicit us, we'll solicit you?
Right, meaning that they were never going to acknowledge me no matter what.
And do you know who the holder is right now?
No, I don't know. They didn't tell me who it was when they told me that the record was 110, and I have never found that information online.
And you've been prolific in other areas, medias as well. Like, how many books have you put out?
I'm currently getting my 16th book printed. I'm anticipating having trouble with that, and I don't really know whether there's shadow banning or whatever the correct term would be going on with it. The book is called The Science, Volume 1. And unlike most of the people I know who evoke the science, I actually read science books. In fact, nobody that I know other than myself reads science books. I read medical science books, mostly for the lay person, the lay reader, but not necessarily entirely. And recently I read the first volume of a book called all right, are you even shooting? Because this guy, he is so incompetent. I'm just gonna stop.
That was my favorite moment.
When your camera slipped.
Yeah, that was great.
Anyway, yeah, I'm glad I got that documented so that I can complain about you for the rest of my life now. Although, actually, I think it's funny too. Oh yeah, so for example, I read the first volume of of History and Pathology of Vaccination by Edgar March Cruikshank, which was published in 1889, which is a very, very thorough look at things from primary source material, a lot of things like letters, actual letters from doctors who were talking about their experiments with vaccination. So this book, The Science, is my extremely lengthy review of books like that, in which I quote things that I think are interesting, such as a doctor describing him giving his perfectly healthy daughter vaccination and then her dying, obviously as a result of the vaccination. his own daughter. Basically, he killed his own daughter for the sake of conducting an experiment. So I find that stuff very relevant, but the relevant to my interest. The point of the science is that people often refer to the science. They say, what does the science say? As if there's one opinion that something called the science represents. So in other words, if the science says that vaccination is 100% safe, then it's true, it's reality. Whereas 150 years ago or whatever, people would have said, what does the priest say? Or what does God say? And they would have had pretty much the same attitude towards it. If the priest had said, you should get the tip of your penis cut off or whatever, that wouldn't be what a priest would say, but that would be what the rabbi would say. And then, of course, that would be considered to be the proper thing to do. Tip of your foreskin, if you want to be technical about it. Anyway, the point of my book, The Science, is that there is no single monolithic opinion that's adhered to by every scientist who's relevant to whatever the subject matter is. It really doesn't matter what it is. There are many different theories, etc., and there are disagreements. So this book, History and Pathology of Vaccination, of which I have the second volume right here, which I'm going to read, but this book details how vaccination replaced inoculation, which is maybe a subtle point that most people don't understand. In my differentiation of the terms, and they're often used interchangeably, inoculation is when a person is given a disease, a particular disease, let's say smallpox, because smallpox was the main thing that inoculation and vaccination originally centered around. So a person would be given smallpox in what was supposed to be a less harmful dose to activate antibodies in order to make it so that if they got hit by the natural occurrence of smallpox in their life, they would already be prepared for it and they wouldn't get sick. So many doctors swore by inoculation as a good practice, but then vaccination came along, and one of the main proponents of it was a guy named Dr. Edward Jenner, who was in London, who started practicing vaccination at the end of the 18th century. And without getting into too much detail, the idea of vaccination was that, in this particular case, that the cowpox, which was considered to be different from the smallpox, could be given to a person to protect them against the smallpox, and that they could not get sick from the cowpox, that it was safer than inoculating them with actual smallpox.
Is this book, is it all reviews?
It's all reviews of medical textbooks, or not textbooks.
And you've also prolifically written a lot of reviews. How many reviews have you
Over
done?
1,500 at this point.
And how long did that take?
Well, I've been doing that for the last 15 years.
And where are those?
Those are online in various places, mainly on Goodreads, but also on Library Thing.
And where are the books available?
Mostly through me, but 3 of them are available easily online. The ones that have been published using print-on-demand presses.
And you've also released some music.
Quite a bit of music, over 200 recordings. I don't remember how many now, maybe 240, which are on record, CD, audio cassette, and computer files online.
What was your first movie you made?
The very first one is called Lamar Chip Layfield, Carol Pat Brown, don't know really what it means. And I deliberately slur out and mumble the last line of the text there. And that was a gambling game. I made that in 1975. The idea was that I would show the movie and people would bet about the movie, make some statement about it or whatever, and then I would show the movie again, and they would again make some statement about the movie. And I have a movie version of it online that I shot in 1995 with a guy named Dan, who was betting a Canadian penny every time. I would only show the movie with people bet on it. So I think I made something like a whopping 3 cents off of that guy, 3 Canadian cents. He was a nice guy who was living off of a trust fund, but the trust fund was apparently very small, so he was extremely cheap about how he spent the money.
What was the last movie you made?
The most recent one is called Nuclear Brain Physics Surgery School Lesion Number 6. Now, that's kind of in a special category of movies because even though it's feature length, it's not one of the ones that I would select as a feature-length movie. Out of the 213 feature-length movies that I have, there's 122 that are currently selected as ones that I would want people to watch under ordinary feature watching conditions, if you can imagine what such a thing might be. The reason why this is not ordinary feature is because in 1978, I founded a thing called tENTATIVely Nuclear Brain Physics Surgery School. And the idea of the school was that you would have to sleep through a lesson, and sleeping through only one lesson would enable you to have the most prestigious career in the world, which would be a nuclear brain physicist surgeon, which of course is a combination of nuclear physics and brain surgery. And so I made a 90-minute lesson for that people slept through, and I had 10 people sleep through it, and then I had them make the next lesson for people to sleep through. And there were 5 graduating classes, making a total of 6 lessons, or lesions as they came to be known. So the movie is basically just the audio from their lesson with images that are added to it that are relevant to them, mostly pictures of the people, well, more or less entirely pictures of either the cassette that it was recorded on, the diploma that they got, and then pictures of the people. Now, in some cases, I don't have very many pictures of the people, so there might be a 9-minute section with only 2 pictures of the person. So it's not really a typical movie in the sense that there's not constant changing imagery, etc. The emphasis is primarily on the soundtrack. So that's why I don't have it be one of my selected ones, but I actually find these movies to be pretty interesting, partially because these lessons or lesions that the people made were only meant to be slept through, and it was eventually to happen that there would be a reunion. And so I think they're fascinating because I get to listen to these recordings that friends of mine made to be slept through. Friends of mine covering a long time span, and roughly, well, 22 years to be exact, and from 1978 to 2000. And I've always been friends with many, many different people, so it's interesting to see what different people would do, because these people were, in some cases, professional musicians, and in other cases, well, one woman was a hairdresser, for example. So I was interested in seeing what she would do, and she actually did a fairly interesting thing. So it's fascinating for me to look back on this and to see what my different friends did at different times in their life. You know, some people went to a great deal of trouble to make something that was thoughtful, and other people just sort of winged it in a way that was obviously spontaneous. So I've been enjoying making these nuclear brain physics surgery school lesion releases a fair amount. I've done 4 so far. There are still 2 more to be done, but I haven't found the tapes that I need to use in order to make these 2 other ones.
All right, give me a second. Okay, so more about the movies that you've made. What was the longest movie that you've made?
I think the longest one is probably Prequel, which is over 10 hours. Now, that was deliberate overkill on my part because I had met a guy locally who was a hurdy-gurdy player, and I was about to make a movie about Vincent van Gogh. And I wanted hurdy-gurdy soundtrack for it, so I asked this guy whether he'd be willing to do it, telling him it would just be a short movie. And he said yes, he was interested, but then he never responded to me when I emailed him about it. So I decided to build a hurdy-gurdy. Now, this was a time when I didn't really have any money, so I could get a hurdy-gurdy kit for something like $125 online. I got it, and I built it, and I shot footage of it basically in real time. It actually took me longer than 10 hours to build, but not a whole lot longer. And then I used that hurdy-gurdy for the soundtrack of this movie, which is called A-GOGH-GOGH, which could be pronounced a go-go or a golf, which is a joke off of how people generally say Vincent van Gogh's name in the United States. We say Vincent van Gogh, but he was Dutch, and in the Netherlands it would have been golf instead of go. So it could be a golf or a go-go. Now, if it's a go-go, then it makes it seem like it's a reference to something that's vital and lively. And basically, I took images of Van Gogh paintings that I had in slide form, and I reshot them in various ways, and then I subjected them to cheesy colorization effects that were available to me through different apps. And then so I made this movie, and then I had this hurdy-gurdy soundtrack to it. But the thing about this hurdy-gurdy is that the hurdy-gurdy that I made is meant really not to be played as an instrument. It's meant to be a sort of art object. But it is playable. It's just extremely bad signal-to-noise ratio. So I made the movie A Golf first, which was only something like 6 minutes long. And then I decided to call this movie of me making the hurdy-gurdy for making the soundtrack of the movie a prequel, meaning it's a prequel to A Golf. So you've got a 6-minute movie and then a 10-hour long movie, which of course would be considered to be extremely boring to just about anyone, myself included, watching me building this thing. It's very tedious. But I thought that was funny, to make a 10-hour long prequel to a movie that's only 6 minutes long. So that's the longest. But then there are ones that aren't quite so long, that such as Don't Walk Backwards, which is something like 8 hours and 23 minutes long, which I made with Etc. in Malaysia and in Australia. And I think that movie is really, really great. It's never been shown anywhere, although I did have an offer to show it somewhere, and I said, no, I want to edit it more before I show it, and then I didn't take up the offer to show it, but I am sorry that I didn't, because after watching through it again, I decided that it was fine the way it was, even though it's so long, that it's in fact a great movie because it covers such a broad variety of subject matter and a broad variety of techniques, that I find it very visually and orally stimulating, and also extremely informative about various things, such as political activism in Australia, of which there's a lot in the movie, such as Goolinguk forest defenders, and many other things. anti-mining activism in the outback. So I think that movie is totally great. And then there's another one that's 3 hours and 40 minutes long or whatever. I don't remember the exact times of these movies, but something like that, called Depot, Wherein Resides the Undead of Franz Kamen. I mentioned that I made one about a documentary about France earlier. And that one is also, I think, one of the greatest things that I've ever done. It's very, very thorough. And actually, the people that I've shown it to have really liked it a lot, despite the fact that it's 3.5 hours long. And the shortest movie is maybe 5 seconds, which some people would say, well, that's not a movie. It's only 5 seconds or whatever. But to me, it's a movie because it's a sequence of moving images. That one is called Breaking News, if I remember correctly. Sometimes I'm finding myself not always able to remember all of the titles of my movies at this point, since there are 701 of them, and a lot of them are ones that I haven't thought about for a long time. But Breaking News is just basically all flashy visuals of the type that they use on TV news programs, where they have these transitions, etc., that make it look like it's really exciting, even though the actual information that they give you is practically non-existent. And in this one, I just do a sort of overkill of stupid sensationalist TV news. And then they're everywhere in between.
And why do you make movies?
Well, I've been at it for 47 years now, and for me it's just a very convenient medium to use for most of the things that I want to express or document. And of course, originally when I started making them in 1975, the opportunities to show them were basically in obscure underground venues. And then, I don't know, by 1985 or so, the work started getting shown in museums a little bit. So I've shown them in museums in multiple parts of the world, such as at the National Art Gallery in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. But also at the CCCB, the Center for Contemporary Culture of Barcelona in Spain, Museum of Modern Art in New York. I've had 3 shows there. Not that many museum shows. I mean, I'm not necessarily that much in favor of the museum shows. Fortunately, I've also got to show them in Squats, which is a venue that's probably the most preferable to me. Squats that are so organized that they've made very nicely created movie theaters, etc., with galleries, etc., in them. Usually those squats eventually get closed down, so they don't necessarily last that long. I think the last 2 shows that I did in squats were, one was in Paris and one was in Slovenia, maybe. And they were both organized by a guy who I'd met online through Facebook. See, now I should remember his name. Vladimir Pavolchek, maybe, but I could be wrong about that, so excuse me. It's been a few years. And but then, of course, by the time that these online presentations started coming along, I just at first was only putting things online that I figured I wouldn't be showing in live presentations anymore. So it wasn't necessarily the stuff that I consider to be the best stuff, or sometimes it was the stuff that was the most historical that I wasn't likely to present anymore. And I know that I'm going over your request that I give short answers, so I apologize for that. But then I just started putting everything online, because the screening opportunities, as I was explaining earlier, have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, until now it's almost impossible for me to arrange a screening anywhere. And it's almost like back to being a beginner again, because I don't get any respect for being number one, the world's most prolific movie maker, but also for being somebody whose work is, in my opinion, extremely original and complex and challenging in various ways that are interesting. So, being able to put it online is great, but then I have to deal with the censorship on YouTube. For example, this most recent movie that I put up online, the one that's Nuclear Brain Physics Surgery School Lesion number 6, was immediately age restricted for 18 and above. Now, I can understand that to a certain extent, but the thing is that the reason why it was age restricted, as far as I know, is because it has nude pictures of me and my girlfriend, who was one of the people who contributed to the lesson. Okay, well, to me the nude body is not something that really needs to be censored so much. I mean, is YouTube going to now cut out all images of paintings from the 19th century that has a nude model in them, or whatever? You know, how extreme is this going to go? And I think about myself. I've been a nudist, I could say, my whole life, but I can definitely remember doing things like going out into the wilderness and taking my clothes off when I was 16 years old. So before I was 18. I did it because I liked being naked. I still like to be naked. So even though some people would find a 69-year-old male naked body to be a little bit less thrilling than my body at age 40, for example. Since I do have a little bit of flab, but not too bad. Not too bad. And so it's a little bit ridiculous to me that this would be age restricted, meaning that people under 18 are being thwarted from watching the movie just because there's naked people in them, in it. And I did make a movie recently with a friend and his family, and his daughter is 14, and she said, I tried to watch movies of yours online, but I wasn't allowed to look at them by YouTube. And I just thought, that's so ridiculous. I mean, this person is trying to watch the movies. She's not somebody who's going to go insane as a result of seeing a person's naked body, or be really even...
Are they available on less...
They're also available for the
like
most
Vimeo
part
or other formats?
On the Internet Archive, which doesn't censor things, but the Internet Archive has its own problems, which is basically that, I don't know whether they're still in the midst of being sued, but they have been being sued because they're making things available that they think should be available, like books. And then the publishers of the books are suing them for that. Really, for me, that's just kind of ridiculous because, excuse me again, all this talking. I like to buy books, and I'm not going to read a book online or on my computer because I find that really annoying. Could you close the lid of that laptop?
Like that?
Yeah, all the way down. Thanks. It has a tendency, because it's old, it's 18-year-old model, it tends to go black when the top is up, and then it won't. I have problems with restarting it again. So the way around that is to put the lid down fairly often. So... and then different movies of mine get blocked or age restricted for different reasons. So, for example, the movie that I mentioned earlier, that's called Wearing Masks Saves Lives. It has a section where I'm trying to eat through the mask, and I can't eat through the mask, so I have to pull the mask down And as soon as the mask is pulled down, since the implication is that if you don't wear a mask, you're actually a murderer. There are people who literally say this sort of thing, as you may or may not have run across. So I do this quick montage of images that I got off the internet of dead people. I don't even find the images to be necessarily that disturbing, because it's not pictures of people with their heads blown off or whatever. It's a picture of a corpse laid out in a field, or for a more natural burial situation or whatever. And then there's a picture from an Asian country, maybe Indonesia, where a relative of the person who is standing posed next to the corpse is put a cigarette in the mouth of the corpse as if the corpse is still alive. So it was done with a sense of humor, etc. And then in some cases, the body doesn't even show at all. There's whatever, a body bag or a sheet over it or something. But the excuse has been used that this is too shocking for children to see, and I'm not one to want children to be traumatized, so I can sort of halfway go along with that and halfway not go along with it. But in other words, there are reasons that YouTube comes up with for either blocking the movies altogether or age restricting them. And I can't say that they have treated me that badly, but there are these idiotic circumstances like I have a movie called Peterson's Restaurant. There's no live sound in Peterson's Restaurant because we were using a type of camera that was supposed to be able to record directly onto the film, but it wasn't working right. And an Auricon camera, that's a brand name. And so therefore the soundtrack for the movie is all overdubbed voiceovers and a couple of sound effects. There's no music in it, and there's no not even in background, because there's no background recordings. Basically, I mean, it's all done just for the sake of the voiceovers and a few insertions of soundtrack material, which also didn't have music in it. So YouTube wrote to me and said that there had been a complaint about the movie because I was using this funk song at such and such a point, at such and such a time during the movie. Well, the reason why this complaint was made, because these companies, which were basically lawyer-run things, had an algorithm that goes through the movies and looks for something that's, say, the length of their song or whatever. And then if anything registers as being the length of their song or in some ways reminiscent of the existence of their song, then they just automatically file a complaint. They don't even bother to check to see whether that song is in the movie. They just file a complaint, a copyright violation complaint. And then they have the right to either prevent the movie from being online at all, or to say that it can't be monetized. None of my movies are monetized anyway, but it can't be monetized unless the money goes exclusively to this company that's making the claim that I've done a copyright violation. So if I had a 6-hour-long movie that had a 2-second excerpt from this company's song, then all money made from my 6-hour-long movie would have to go to that company, which is, of course, utterly stupid.
Well, considering that you've made millions from your movies,
and of course I've lost my entire life off of everything that I create because they're so unpopular. But occasionally I'll make a little bit here and there, but very little and not enough to pay for the expenses. So anyway, back to this story about this movie, Peterson's Restaurant. So I appealed the thing and I said, this is an algorithm mistake. Just look at the point in the movie. It's not there. There is no song in the movie. There is no music in the movie at all. Well, okay, so they relented on that one. They, the lawyers were like, oh, gee, there's no movie there. But the thing is that if I hadn't appealed it, They could make a completely unsubstantiated claim, and they could win just because they made a complaint. So more recently, I had a movie online in which I explained my name, the name Tentatively a Convenience, and I was explaining it to my girlfriend at the time, and we were in a hotel room. And so you can see that it's a hotel room. She made a complaint to YouTube that it was in violation of her privacy because it showed us in the hotel room. Now, I know from having talked with her about it in the past that what she was really afraid of is that there's a point in the movie where she goes like this, which means she's adjusting her bra strap underneath her shirt. So I don't even think the bra strap necessarily shows. But apparently that made her look too slatternly, and she's a person who makes a lot of money at a university job. So therefore she could complain about this movie, which is me explaining my name. The whole point of the movie is me explaining my name. It was made with her full knowledge. She's sitting there with the cameras in plain view, and we were talking about the subject. But since she's now my ex-girlfriend, then she makes a privacy complaint. And then I had the choice of either blurring her face out in the video, which wouldn't blur out her bra strap adjustment, her one-time, 1 second long bra strap adjustment. I could do that. I could blur out her face, even though her name would still be in the title. Or I could remove the video altogether. And this is the kind of shit that I have to deal with in relation to YouTube all the time, and which other people complain about even way more than I do. But I have accumulated a fair amount of examples of things that I just consider to be incredibly stupid.
Okay, what was your favorite movie?
Oh, well, I don't really have a favorite. I might have 100. I have a web page online that's specifically of my favorite movies, and I don't know how many of them I have on there right now. I think it's called Personal Favorites, maybe. But there are definitely over 100. It might be over 200. The one that I mentioned earlier, Depot, wherein resides the undead of Franz Cayman, is certainly high up there. But I've been liking a lot of the recent things that I've been making. I made one a little over 2 years ago. No, a little over a year ago, called Bent, that I like a lot. That's another feature. I've been making a whole series of movies that were shot in places that I traveled to, both for the sake of taking a vacation, but also for the sake of making a movie. So the first one of this series is called Like a Decoy Out of Water. I like that one a lot. I love it. That was made in Delaware. And then I made one called, or was it Delaware? Yeah, Delaware. And then I made one called, well, Bent would have been the second one in the series. And then I made a few more this year, Bent having been made in September of 2021. So I made one called School of Negativity, the Brains That Wouldn't Dry. I like that one a lot. There's another one called Slaughter Beach Bingo Party. I made that with my friend Eddie Watkins and his daughter. There's another one called Signal Drummers of Smith Island. I really love that one. That was again made with Eddie Watkins and his family. And then the most recent one of the series is called Me, Myself, and I. That was made in honor of my 69th birthday. That's very short. But I like that one a lot too. I think they're all visually interesting and orally interesting and really funny. Even friends of mine sometimes agree that they're funny. People seem to like Me, Myself, and I a lot. And one of the things that I've discovered over the decades is that if I show a movie that's 5 minutes long, people like it. If I show a movie that's an hour long, they don't like it. Even if it's really divided into 12 5-minute sections, they still don't like it because it's just too much. So, for example, Bent, which I think is one of the best things I've ever done, that's about 2 hours and 15 minutes long, and I'm sure most people find that really trying. It's basically a movie in which I'm flown in a helicopter to an island and held captive because I've been sent into exile for being a heretic, a thought criminal. And the movie is me just gradually going insane on this island because I've been given a time-release psychoactive drug as a part of my punishment, as a part of my exile. And the only companionship that I have are holograms and people that I managed to communicate with through a turtle retinal scanner, which is the device that is used to make sure that I haven't escaped from my prison. See, I finally stopped talking. Next question.
What genre would you say your movies?
Well, one of the reasons why they're so unpopular is because they are definitely outside genre. I'm sure you probably noticed that most movies, as most Hollywood movies, have to have people killed in them more or less constantly in order to keep the audience emotionally engaged. My movies actually don't have murder in them. There might be a few exceptions where I'm using found footage from a Hollywood movie that has a murder in it, or a few other exceptions, but for the most part, I don't have car chases, murders. I do have breasts, but I also have full-on nudity, so I go too far in that direction as far as what can be gotten away with, as far as the public, the general public is concerned. I would say that the easiest, simplest thing would be to call most of them experimental documentaries, which are sometimes also called avant-docs. And there is a book about avant-docs, which doesn't list me, but lists people who've made, say, 2 of them, whereas I've made 500 and some. Excluding me from that book is just an example of how idiotic it all is, because the book is basically about rich people in a particularly small area that the author is familiar with because he teaches in that area. And a working class guy like me is basically best ignored. Even I find working class people hate working class intellectuals, which is what I consider myself to be, because there's a sort of contempt of intellectuals as people who aren't capable of doing anything of any practical nature. So therefore, if you're a working class intellectual, it means that basically you're not really working class. So working class people will hate you because you're an intellectual, but intellectuals will hate you because you're working class. And that kind of goes across the board for the genres of my movies. They usually push the genre barriers whenever they, or boundaries, whenever they refer to genres at all, pre-existing genres at all. For me, it's fine to go from being one type of movie to another type of movie to another type of movie within the same movie. Or it's fine to just focus on things, esoteric content that I know that very few people have an interest in. I mean, you saw that movie of mine called Consciousness Expansion Score movie recently, and I know that, or at least I think that you liked it a lot. And that movie is the project of a couple of years of work, really, really labor intensive, but its subject matter is basically me building an extension onto my house. Now, to many people, that would be considered to be utterly stupid subject matter, because when people make documentaries, they want some tragedy in it usually. So there was a documentary maker who made a documentary about traveler kids who did train hopping. Well, the best thing that could happen in this documentary from this guy's perspective was that one of the train hoppers would die from a heroin overdose, so there would be a tragedy. When I make movies about things like that, the people don't die from heroin overdoses. In fact, they're shown to be intelligent people who are capable of being creative and living outside the box and not really having tragic lives. Well, that kind of goes against the mainstream documentary approach to things, in which death and misery have to be used or presented in order to engage the audience. Very little positivity is allowed, although there are probably documentary makers who would disagree with me about this, and who might be right to a certain extent.
I don't got anything else.
I didn't think we would really go for only a half an hour.
That was.
You ready?
Yep.
Okay, so I make movies. I am, to the best of my knowledge, the most prolific movie maker in the entire 127 years of movie making history. I've made 701 movies now. I think 213 of them are features, meaning an hour or more by my reckoning. Sometimes people say that features are 70 minutes or longer, but I use an hour as the cutoff point. So I have 4 different computer stations set up around the house. All of these being older computers, each one having different qualities, different software that I can use or whatever that I use for video editing, and or as I prefer, Vaudeo, V-A-U-D-E-O, because that seems more etymologically correct, because it refers to visual and audio. So anyway, this one I just use for Photoshop, so I can scan something and then bring the files down here on a USB stick and edit them in the way that I want to, and then I can take them back and use them to animate them, etc. upstairs. So I don't use the station very much, and as you can see, it's extremely awkwardly placed, but as you can also see, my house is incredibly crowded, and I have to fit things wherever I can. So, that's all I really wanted to say about this station. I kind of like that I have it set up so that I have to sit here on the floor. So we'll move into where another station is. This is probably the most feeble of the computers that I have. I'll turn off a few of the lights since we don't need them anymore. And watch your step here because I have camera gear there. My house is really extremely well organized, but I've been traveling a lot over the last 6 months, which means that I keep discombobulating everything, and then when I come back, I don't necessarily get it reorganized again. So, for example, I was shooting a movie in eastern Pennsylvania, and I bought this African helmet mask, which I wanted to use as a prop in the movie, which I like very much. And then I used it in one movie and one performance. And now I have it sitting in this box that I made for it to protect it. This is supposed to be an elephant trunk, or so I'm told. I think it's very, very beautifully made. I love it. It was also expensive by my standards, but it seemed worth it for this movie that I made. And then I liked the way it worked in this performance that I gave. The movie was made in eastern Pennsylvania and western New Jersey, but the performance was in Roanoke, which is where I've been going a lot lately. well, I shouldn't say a lot. I've done 2 performances there, partially because it's just about the only place that seems to have any interest in what I do. There's certainly almost no interest in it in Pittsburgh anymore, which is something that I want to talk about eventually. Because I feel like I have entered an era of unprecedented censorship. At least in relation to my own work. Maybe not everybody's experiencing that. I suspect a lot of people are. So this room is the room of other people's movies, which includes VHS, but also DVDs, Blu-rays, film strips, which I have in boxes, 16mm, which I also have in boxes, and even a few 35mm, but not entire films, just trailers, I think, or fragments of films. But it's also a room where I had another editing station, where I did a fair amount of editing, which is right here. Another place that's pretty cramped, but there was a series of power failures in the neighborhood sometime during the year, and eventually it fried this one computer. And one friend of mine was making fun of me, saying, "Oh, well, all you have to do is take the computer out and take it someplace and get it repaired." Like I was a complete idiot, as if that would never occur to me that I might do that. And I didn't bother to get into an argument with her about it, but there were a couple of things that made that a little bit more difficult than what she was referring to. One of which is that the thing is tucked underneath here with films on top of it, etc. It's not easy to get to. It's plugged in the back here where it's almost impossible for me to get to because I've had to build the space in the way that I have, again, to take advantage of the limited amount of space that I have. And the other thing is that I don't necessarily have things on my computer that I want a computer repair person to see. And I'm not talking about things like pornography. I'm talking about things like videos of festivals that I've been a part of or whatever that aren't necessarily illegal, but and well, actually weren't illegal, but would have a type of content that is unusual enough so that some person who's just a technician might find it weird or offensive or whatever, and might cause trouble for me by erasing it, for example, etc. So there's a lot of interesting things in this room. For example, if you look up there on that wall, there's a game board that we made especially for a movie that was originally going to be called Dare. So you see the word Dare written upside down, but then we ended up calling it Start, which you might not be able to see from your position because it's underneath the pheasant wing, but the word Start is also the beginning of the game board. And then there's all sorts of posters from different movies that I find interesting, such as Film Isht by Gustav Deutsch, or Louis Buñuel's That Obscure Object of Desire, C'est Obscur Objet du Désir, and many other things. Including a Neowist Film Festival from 1999, which is faded because it was printed on blueprint paper, and blueprints fade. Now, right now, I'm in the midst of trying to put away DVDs that have accumulated in various places, mostly in piles on the steps. So I have put this box here in my way, and there's another box underneath it that's also in my way, but we're going to step over these and go upstairs, and these will be eventually moved, and it'll be easier to get into the room again. I have a couple of large inflatables that I used in a recent movie that I made, so this is another example of, and here's more DVDs too, this is another example of me going somewhere, shooting a movie, bringing the props back, not having a place to put the props. This is a giant inflatable pizza slice and a giant inflatable high heel that I used in a movie of mine called Me, Myself, and I, which I really like, that I made in honor of my 69th birthday. Did you see that one? Me, Myself, and I. Anyway, so then we go upstairs. And, you know, watch your step, although there's not much stuff on the steps right now, so it's not too unsafe. Movie posters here, too, such as one about the Weather Underground. And here's a sign that I made for a movie called Party Propaganda, which, as you can see, has circled A's. And the sign for the title scene of the movie was set on fire, so it was covered with match heads and rubber cement. I cut the sign out using a jigsaw. I think it looks pretty nice. I really love that title scene in the movie with the sign on fire and other things happening too. That movie got blocked on YouTube because, well, they used various excuses. The first excuse was that I had excerpts from Triumph of the Will, Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, which most people would know as a documentary about the big Nuremberg Nazi rally. And I'm an anti-Nazi, and the movie was made in the spirit of mocking Triumph of the Will. The movie shows propaganda from three different political positions. One, Triumph of the Will. Another one, Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which is another film that I completely despise, but which is widely credited as setting the basis for the way Hollywood movies were made. And it's a revered film. Anyway, and then the third film was Eisenstein, and I think Alexander Poff also worked on that one, if I remember correctly, but I could be misremembering that. October, which I think is a great film, but which is also basically a communist propaganda film and has really exaggerated views of how evil the bourgeoisie was, that would then reinforce the notion of the justifiability of the revolution. So anyway, I used excerpts from all three of those films as outstanding examples of propaganda films of the early 20th century, and then I used footage of my own that represented parties that I thought represented more what I philosophically and politically am in favor of in relation to socio-political attitudes. That included so-called hardcore pornography. But when YouTube blocked it, they blocked it because they said that I was promoting hate speech by having Triumph of the Will be in there. And they had just recently banned Triumph of the Will from YouTube, but they didn't ban Birth of a Nation, obviously because it's an American film that's revered, etc., even though it's a completely hateful film as far as I'm concerned. So I thought that was interesting because they didn't have any problem with me using Birth of a Nation in party propaganda, but they had a big problem with me using Triumph of the Will. It seemed that both of them were objectionable from my perspective. October I have a little bit more complex feelings about because I do think it's a great film, whereas I don't think the other two are great at all. Anyway, so I appealed that on YouTube and I said, well, the obvious point of the movie is to mock these propaganda movies and to mock the Nazism of Triumph of the Will. So you're acting like I'm promoting hate speech when in fact I'm satirizing it. So they backed off of that, but then they claimed that I was in violation of their copyright because October has music by Shostakovich in it, and they said that I was violating the copyright of Shostakovich's music. Well, that was a little more than a little bit ridiculous because Shostakovich's music was from something like, I don't know, 1932 or whatever. I forget the exact year, but the 30s, if I remember correctly. It must have been the 30s. It could have been earlier, but I think it was the 30s. And therefore, any copyright that had anything to do with the actual composer, or even probably the people who had recorded the soundtrack, the orchestra who recorded the soundtrack, would have been long since passed. So the only people who would have perpetuated any copyright would have just been basically lawyers who were trying to make sure that somebody continued to make money off of something that they had nothing to do with. So I don't think I even bothered to argue with him after that. But the thing that was amazing to me is that there's also a scene of 5 people having sex, and there's a guy who's fucking a woman doggy style who has another woman painting a circle A on his chest while a guy jerks off in front of her face. And then there's some girls who pee on the girl who has paint on her and so forth and so on, because they dump a bucket of paint on this girl who's getting fucked. And they didn't complain about that at all, which really shocked me. So they banned it for the 2 reasons that I already, or blocked it for the 2 reasons that I already mentioned, but they never said anything about the porn. That was weird. But at any rate, I ended up having to put the movie on only on the Internet Archive, which I believe I have it on now. But I like that movie. Anyway, so then this is my bedroom. I'm going to just make it a little bit easier to get past this for you. And my bedroom is where I keep all of my own movies. Downstairs was other people's movies. And again, I like to make the joke that once upon a time I had a very active sex life, and therefore the bed would have been cleared off and would have been a little bit cleaner than it is, because one side of the bed would have been for me and the other side of the bed would have been for my girlfriend. So now I refer to this stuff that I tend to pile up on the bed, which is usually books and such like things. I refer to that as my girlfriend, because this is where the girlfriend used to sleep. The brain that wouldn't die, or as I like to say, the brain that wouldn't dry. So if you look up here, you'll see that this is where most of my VHS tapes are. And then if you look here, you'll see that this is where many of my DVDs are, although they continue elsewhere. And then if you were to look inside these drawers, you would see many of the mini DV tapes that I have. Mini DV was a terrible format, which most of them don't even work anymore. And then over here, there's a box and a suitcase, and the box has all Super 8 and regular 8, and maybe, oh, there's a tape that shouldn't be in there, and maybe film strips. Actually, I think the film strips are in the suitcase. So in the suitcase, it's all my 16mm stuff, with the exception of this film, which was shot for me by Tony Balco, which you're in, by the way. It's of the 21st rehearsal of High Tech. So, and then there's other stuff in here too, like obviously audio tapes, which were down here, and DVDs that I'm in the midst of watching right now, DVDs and Blu-rays that I'm in the midst of watching right now. So, but there's also this computer. The first laptop I ever got was this model. This is a 2004, and that one futzed out eventually, ceased to work, but I got somebody to find a replacement for me, because the thing about this computer is that it was the last of the ones that could have a so-called classic operating system, meaning an older system. I think Mac OS 9. And I have a lot of old software, such as Adobe PageMill, which is, I just noticed that something is working here. That's surprising. It didn't work the last time. the Adobe PageMill version, which is what I use for making websites, is from 1997. So it's 25 years old. Therefore, it would be considered to be completely obsolete by most people's standards, but it was supposedly the first user-friendly website design software, and I still really like it because it's incredibly easy to use, even though you can't really do anything that would be considered to be flashy by today's standards, but that's all right with me because it's good enough for my purposes, and the people who host my websites for free probably prefer the much lower amount of memory taken up, because I have about 10,000 files on my websites, and if they were using more modern software, it would probably take up 4 times as much memory. I think that the website server for my sites is probably an old computer stuck in a closet at an institution somewhere, and it's probably being hosted very surreptitiously. So, again, it's rather extremely chaotic, except that actually all of this stuff is organized. So if you look at the, I mean, basically everything is organized except for the spillover, and the spillover is what's the problem. So if you look at these boxes, for example, this one right here says 107 to 129, 1988 to 1988, and that is all referred to in both a computer file and a book that I have tucked down there. So if anybody wanted to look up something, which obviously I'm the only person who does it, but if somebody wanted to look up something by mine and find out where it was, it would be just a matter of looking through this computer file or through the book, finding out what number it is, and then finding the relevant box and pulling it out of the box, which is something I do fairly often because I continue to digitize things. So then, let's go across the hall and watch your step here, particularly because there's piles of books that are just waiting to be avalanches everywhere. Again, the library is extremely well organized, meaning that all of the books are up on shelves in categories, organized chronologically and by author and or subject, depending on which is most important. So, for example, this is the end of the literature section right here, which means that, you know, it goes from Neil Stevenson to Stern, to a book about Stern, to Tom Stetson and his book about, or no, it's not by Tom Stetson. Oh yeah, it's a Tom Stetson. Tom Stetson is the hero, Tom Stetson and the Giant Jungle Ants, which I haven't read, but I like to pick up these kids' books every once in a while. They're the older ones, so forth and so on. It's all organized by author and then sub-organized by the chronology of that author. So, do you want a chair? Because I can give you a chair if it's... okay, so this is the main computer that I do editing at. And I am definitely extremely prolific. I just finished and uploaded yesterday my 701st movie. And I use a free software for doing it, CyberDuck, which I did actually pay for twice, but I only paid a very small amount of money for it, $5 each time. And so I am grateful to CyberDuck for being perfect for my purposes. I'm going to upload a few things right now. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and this, by the way, right behind me, is the film section of my library. So I've got things like the issues of Film Culture, which is a really fantastic magazine. This issue or no, the American Federation of the Arts rather has an advertisement on the back that says that it has films available by Kenneth Anger, Bruce Bailey, Robert Breer, Hollis Frampton, Barry Gerson, Red Grooms, Will Hindle, George Landau, Standish Lauder, Willard Moss, Marie Menken, Yvonne Rayner, Paul Sharits, Harry Smith, and Michael Snow. Anyway, this was one of my favorite film magazines. Not necessarily the favorite, but certainly one of the top 5. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was how amazing it is to me that I am literally the world's most prolific movie maker, unless there's someone who can disprove that, which I don't think anybody has so far, but whatever. I do actually try to research whether that's true or not, and I've left the record holders in the dust for so long now that it's ridiculous. Okay, I just uploaded some more files, and now I think I'll go to one of my websites. So I have quite a few websites online. One of them is my Movieography, and yes, I just updated that. So the 2 most recent films are called, or movies rather, are called Nuclear Brain Physics Surgery School Lesion Number 6, and then tE Nuclear Brain Physics Surgery School Diploma 4 Lesion 5, and then Consciousness Expansion Score Movie at the Harris Theater, which is the thing that you were at, etc., etc., etc. So I tried to get the Guinness Book of Records to acknowledge me as the person who had made the most feature-length movies, and they weren't having it. Now, when I first wrote to them, I had made something like 108 features. Right now, I am up to, I said earlier, 213 rather. Yeah, 213, that's correct. So, so I wrote to them, and they said, well, we have a record holder who has 110 movies, so write to us if you surpass that. So when I got up to something like 111, I wrote to them, and they denied it to me. So on this website about my features, I have the Guinness Book response. Thank you for your message. However, Guinness World Records is both an arbiter and a curator of world records. Whilst thousands of records are applied for proactively from the public every year, a vast number of superlative facts are sourced from expert consultants and institutions in order to provide a more complete snapshot of the world we live in. We do not invite proactive applications for records such as the one you are proposing. Well, that goes contrary to what they say in an earlier email. In an earlier email, when I first applied to them, they said, unfortunately, it says, thank you for sending us the details of your recent record attempt for most feature-length movies. We are afraid to say that we were unable to accept this as a Guinness World Record. Unfortunately, we do already have a record for this category, and what you have achieved does not better this. The current world record is 110. Please feel free to contact us again if you exceed this achievement. So, please feel free to contact us again if you achieve this, if you exceed this achievement, which is later followed by a message that says, we do not invite proactive applications for records such as the one you are proposing. What? So, whatever. I just thought that was bullshit. And my general impression of Guinness is that they're not really looking so much for people who break their records as they are looking for businesses who will pay them to help stage something that would be a publicity stunt for their business. So, for example, you have a sub shop and you want to get a good publicity thing going, so you contact Guinness Book of World Records and they say, yes, you can hire our team and we will teach you how to make a 50-foot long sub, and then your sub shop will become famous for having the largest sub ever, or whatever, even though that really doesn't have much to do with what their actual business is. So, but as I write at the end of this, I say, regardless, Guinness's rejection was a big disappointment to me insofar as I'm desperately trying to survive financially and feel that such international recognition would go a long way to making it easier for me to screen these movies and to get paid for doing so. As it currently stands, I'll probably die before I get such recognition. And unfortunately, I think that still holds true. I'm not accustomed to talking this much, so not these days at least, so I do tend to cough. But so there's one example of me being, I think, an extraordinary person, and then the people who could hypothetically recognize this and acknowledge it preferring to just sort of sweep me under the rug. But another thing that's been happening during the time of what I call the quarantine is that I've made myself extremely unpopular by criticizing the way that the pandemic has been opportunistically used in order to create what I consider to be a medical industry police state. And since that goes against the grain of what's considered to be liberal opinion, and since liberals are supposedly the people who would have hypothetically liked me in the old days, I'm more or less completely shunned, and I'm both a scapegoat, which I've always been, but also an outcast, which I've also always been, but now it's even more extreme. And one of the things that's happened is that there's a whole history in Pittsburgh, which is where I live, of film presenting groups that would prefer to present work of mine because they agree that I'm good at what I do, that I make original work that's very meticulously done, etc. And one of those groups, one of those film presentation groups, is called the Film Kitchen. The Film Kitchen's been around since 1998. I contributed to it every year. I was probably the most frequent contributor to it ever. But as of the time of the beginning of the quarantine, I started getting cut out of it more and more as people started trying to not rock any of the boats, not necessarily even ones having to do with what the actual situation is with the so-called pandemic, whether it's a plandemic or a scamdemic or whatever. And so, for example, last October, the Film Kitchen had finally relocated to an actual physical location instead of being a Zoom presented thing, which is what it was for a while. And I was invited to be a part of a Halloween presentation, so I have a movie that I made on my 60th birthday of a masked nudist party at Trundle Manor. And it's only, whatever, 6-minute movie, something fairly short. There's no sex in it, but there is nudity in it. So breasts and penises show. Apparently, breasts and penises are some new thing that people are horrified by, that they haven't really gotten used to yet. I don't know whether they think they're tumors or whatever, but apparently they're definitely terrified of them. So, the Film Kitchen conveniently lost the movie that I just sent them a file of, so it didn't matter in terms of the basic material. But then they also didn't put me on the program. And I think the reason for this is because the sponsorship for Film Kitchen is of a person who is not a movie maker, who just has some money and has some connections and wants to give the illusion, if only to themselves, that they are connected to the cultural world, the culture producing world. So since this was a new space, person who was presenting the Film Kitchen at the space was probably worried that having one of my movies there would be controversial and that they might lose access to the space. But I showed up anyway with a version of the movie, and I think they were probably a little bit too embarrassed to just outright say no to me, so we showed the movie. And hypothetically, Film Kitchen pays the participants in the event. They used to back in the golden era of the Film Kitchen, but 6 months or maybe 8 months, as much as 8 months later, I got an email from Film Kitchen saying, "Oh, we owe you $12.50 or whatever it was, something like that, for your participating in this Halloween screening. How do you want us to send you the money? Or would you prefer that we just put the money towards keeping Film Kitchen running?" Well, since I was dissatisfied with the way that they treated me, since I think they were basically trying to censor me out of things because they couldn't deal with there being nudity, which I just find mind-bogglingly stupid and retrogressive, I said that yes, I wanted the $12.50, and then they never paid me. So they wrote to me basically hoping that I would say, "Oh, you just take the money," and didn't pay me. So that's one example of an institution, a screening presenter institution in Pittsburgh that before the quarantine would have not censored me, at least not for something like this, just nudity, and would have maybe paid me, maybe not, I don't know. But I'm a little bit disgusted, or more than a little bit disgusted by the treatment. And then there's a thing called the Doc Salon, which I like a lot, which is run by a guy named Will Zavala, who does an excellent job. And I am the most prolific documentary maker in Pittsburgh, if not in the world. I think I probably am the most prolific documentary maker of all time, again, of all 127 years of movie making history. According to my own calculation, I will tell you how many documentaries I've made out of all my movies. 552 documentaries. That's kind of amazing, I think. 552 documentaries. Now, of course, most of them are about things that I'm directly connected with, but not, in other words, they're basically about things like the inserts that I put on, etc., such as the one that you witnessed recently at the Harris Theater. But they're not all like that. Many of them are about things that friends of mine do, or about political events or whatever. So I approached the Doc Salon, where I've shown work many times, about showing a documentary that I'd made about a friend of mine named Doug Retzler, who's an environmental activist and artist whose work I think is very good, and he's a guy that I've known now for 51 years. So I know him very well, and I have footage that dates back to things like his high school photograph from when he was 15. So I made a documentary about him, and Will rejected it, which he'd never done before. He'd never rejected any of the documentaries that I had shown before, including one that's 3.5 hours long, which he actually really liked a lot. That's about Franz Kamen. He was a friend of mine. He was a composer, pianist, etc. And he said that the documentary was too detailed and too long. It's over 2 hours long. So the thing about that is that means that Will, who I definitely like, and I really like the Doc Salon, is trying to commercialize it more by making it not too much of a strain for the audience, because he too is having to struggle to find places to present the work, etc., to get funding for it, etc., and he's doing a good job of it. From my perspective, my documentary about Doug is very good and should be interesting to people who are interested in environmental artists. Doug isn't, his work isn't that well known. Okay, so that was one of the other two presenting organizations that has now rejected me. And then there's a guy named Mike Meriden who does a series called Synced, which is something that I really like a lot. Synced is a series where Mike solicits silent movies from local movie makers and asks them to make something with the idea in mind that musicians will be paired with the movie to perform a live soundtrack to it. And I don't know how many of these things Mike has done, probably at least 10 of them over a fairly long time, like over, I don't know, 11 years. But it's a fun series, and it's an interesting challenge. The thing about what most people do is that most people who are the invited movie makers, is that they just make a movie that's a movie that they would ordinarily make. Sometimes they even take a movie that they already have and just remove the sound from it. And then and they don't do anything that's really meant to necessarily excite or in any special way engage the people who are making the music. And then the musicians just play whatever they ordinarily play, maybe trying to sync it a little bit to the movie by having a dramatic emphasis at some point where there's dramatic emphasis in the movie, or having it be atmospheric for a particular type of thing, or whatever. But they don't really put that much work into it or that much thought into it. So for the entire time that I've made these movies, I always make them in a way that challenges the musician. I make what are called score movies. So the first one that I made for this series was called Spectral Evidence Trailer. And it had, in very faint white lettering over top specific scenes of the movie, it had instructions for song structure. So there might be something like chorus 1, chorus 2, etc. So the challenge to the musicians was to try to both follow the movie in some way that they thought was appropriate in terms of the typical notion of what soundtrack is, but also trying to follow the instructions. And my friend Caleb Gamble was in a band called Lungs, Face, Feet, and they were the one who were going to perform this. And Caleb said, "You're just fucking with us, aren't you? You know, like trying to make it more difficult for us or whatever." And I basically explained probably that, no, not really. I was referring to song structure because I know that they tend to use song structure. So I was trying to give something that was targeted to them, but that would up their ante a little bit and make it more challenging for them. And they actually did a great job, a really, really great job. It was beautiful. So that's what I've done throughout my whole history of making movies for Synced. And one of them was called Ben Opie, and it was made exclusively of footage of Ben Opie, who's been my collaborator now for 27 years. And Ben did a really amazing job of playing it as a score, etc. And that's one of my favorite pieces as a result of Ben's beautiful playing that goes along with it. But then, so more recently, this past December, Mike Meriden, the guy who founded Synced, contacted me and said, "Can you make a 1 minute long movie for Synced?" So I made a 1 minute long movie called Catatonias, which is a score movie, which has instructions that basically say that for each second, the musicians must play first 60 notes, then 59 notes, then 58 notes, all the way counting down to 1. And Mike rejected it. Now, while this isn't necessarily an overt rejection of it for reasons having to do with the current tyranny, I think that it's part and parcel of what's happening in the culture right now. I think that, for one thing, people are lazy and not particularly open-minded. So I think probably he looked at it and he was like, these musicians can't play this. And I even wrote to him and I said it would probably be best to get musicians who are classically trained and who play avant-garde music, because they're just about the only people who'd be able to play something this difficult. But then he just